I chose Illusional Fear because the name is very original and it's quite typical of the horror genre as it's simple, just like some examples Silent Hill and The Wicker Man. They're both simple but very effective. I also chose it because the film synopsis is about a girl who thinks someone is stalking her. Or could it be her imagination, like an illusion? That was one thing I wanted the audience to ask. Was it real? Or just an illusion? I chose this location for my opening sequence, as from looking at other horrors, I've noticed they only used one or a few locations, so I thought it'd be more successful if I just used one location, but maybe like a larger area. That's why I chose a street rather than just like a room or something. It's also very typical as they usually use dark and remote areas because it creates more suspense and builds more tension. When deciding on the costumes and props for my opening sequence, I looked at other horrors to get an idea. I really liked in Silent Hill as they didn't use any props. This definitely influenced my decision as I only used the dog really as a prop. I think this made the character much more vulnerable, which is very typical of the horror genre, and I didn't want it to be too predictable, so that's why I didn't include a weapon or of some kind at all. When editing my opening sequence, I wanted a different pace throughout. So I started off with a slower editing pace and it increased towards the end. This is because I wanted to build tension and suspense more towards the end, because it's when something happened, it was when she fell over. This is very typical of the horror genre, as the pace always seems to increase when something is about to happen, which could potentially change the mood or the atmosphere. I used a variety of shots because I wanted to make it easy for the audience to follow the character and also to set the right mood and atmosphere. When deciding on a font and a style for my titles, I looked at other horror openings. Most of them used like black and white or black and red, so I decided to use one of these colour schemes for my openings. I decided on black and white because I really like the contrast of the two colours. I also used a really simple font, but it's also kind of like a solid and important text. It's very assertive. I didn't want it to be flouncy because that's what you would expect from a social realism film. My storyline is established very quickly in my opening sequence. I used a very typical storyline of a person following another person. I know this idea is very successful and I know it works because many horrors have also used this storyline. Most horrors do have predictable stories. Within watching the first couple of minutes, you know what's going to happen. But my storyline isn't completely predictable, as it could be an illusion and it couldn't actually be happening. The character could just be imagining it. I think this is what makes my opening different to other horrors. I think my opening sequence is identified as horror, as I've used lots of typical conventions which horrors use. For example, my location is very dark and dingy, and it's very remote, and the character is almost trapped between the houses on the street. The music is very eerie and dramatic, which is very typical of horrors, and also my character is very vulnerable. Usually in horrors is a very vulnerable woman, and she's usually caught out or trapped. And just the general pace of my opening sequence, it's fast to heighten tension at times when something's about to happen, which is very typical of horrors. You wouldn't find that very much in social realism films. My character isn't particularly introduced obviously in my opening. I've done this on purpose though, because many horrors tend to do this. It makes the audience want to watch more, to find out more about them and how they got into that situation and why it's happened particularly to them. Although my character is introduced through her action of her walking her dog. It does reveal a little bit about her, especially it brings out the fact she's a very vulnerable character as she's going out alone at night time, which not a lot of people tend to do. I only used a few special effects in my opening sequence. I used some effects in my titles to fade them so they ran a bit smoother and they weren't so abrupt when they finished. And I used a couple at the end of my sequence. I used a fade to black one to mimic her closing her eyes and blinking as she hit the ground at quite a hard pace that she's about to blank out. I also used a defocus filter because it builds the tension and the idea that she's about to pass out. and that she's losing focus of her dog and her dog's running away.